Hello, everyone. So welcome to Slugs and Steins, lectures from UC Santa Cruz. Tonight, we celebrate the start of our 6th year of this series, believe it or not. My name is Mike Reapy. I'm a past president of the UCSC Alumni Council and one of your volunteer organizers tonight. With me is David Hansen, also from the UCSC Alumni Council, and Kayla Judd with the Alumni Relations Office. Like we did last month, David, Kayla, and I will be staying on screen during the talk so that our speaker doesn't feel like she's just talking to herself. For those who are new, our Slugs and Steins series engages a UC Santa Cruz faculty member in discussion with you, the local community of the Monterey Bay and Silicon Valley, and our extended community online, with the goal of making us all Renaissance people. So welcome. We wanted to feel just like you're at UC Santa Cruz sitting in class, but with a drink in your hand and without tests. Before we get started, and since we can't see you, we'd like to know where you're zooming in from and how many people are watching. Please take a moment to fill out a short poll that will pop up on your screen. We'll share the results after we've given everyone a moment to respond. Only 2 questions, so it shouldn't take you too long. Okay, now you should see the results of the poll on your screen and who is in the virtual room with you right now. 80% of us, just one person watching, but we've got a good number of couples, 3 in the room, no bigger groups. And most of our people, as expected, are tuning in from Santa Cruz County, but got a good number from the Bay Area, 22% other regions in California, 13, we've got 6 people from other places in the US, 2 people from outside the US, which is amazing. And one person took our trap and answered from outer space. So it's either the space station or us. We will be tipping our steins this evening with Galina Hale, professor of economics at UC Santa Cruz. She served as a research advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and as an assistant professor of economics at Yale University. Galina's current research interests focus on attracting mainstream finance to climate solutions, the sustainability of the global food system, and international financial stability, especially with respect to climate risks. Galina has published over 30 articles in leading economics and finance peer-reviewed journals. She serves on multiple editorial boards and presents her work regularly at scholarly and public policy meetings worldwide. We will have a detailed Q&A at the end of the talk tonight, but Galina may take a few burning questions during the talk. We have a few opportunities. So don't wait until the last minute. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. If you see someone else's question that you like, you can upvote it and we'll ask it sooner. David and I will be taking turns asking your questions. In a few days, you'll be able to find this lecture on the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel. We'll post the links in our social media channels and our follow-up emails, so stay tuned. Okay, does everyone have their steins? Great, I've got your slug. Professor Hale.
Thank you so much, Mike, for inviting me to be a speaker today. It's very exciting. My advisor, I did my PhD at UC Berkeley, and my advisor was one of the very first students at UC Santa Cruz, Barry Eichengreen. So I have this somewhat remote but very special connection to UC Santa Cruz alumni. Let me share the screen. I hope everybody can see. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a serious question, I guess, about climate change and inequality today. And I don't know why it's jumping around. But I will not give a doom and gloom talk today. I got too depressed working on climate change over time. And so I started thinking about climate solutions. And talking about climate solutions is a lot more exciting. And I've been in a better mood ever since I started thinking more about solutions than about problems. So I encourage everybody to be in the same space with me. So We used to think that climate change and inequality were two separate issues, but increasingly everybody understands that these are very closely related. And so I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk also about some solutions that have been offered and how to fund those solutions and who is funding those solutions and what needs to be done in order to solve the climate change at the time, in the time frame that we actually have for the solution. So this complicated slide is basically showing that the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations put together around the turn of the century or millennium, they're not all complementary. And so this diagram is showing you that if the square is a blue, it means that two different goals have synergies. And if the square is an orange, it means they have trade-offs. And the goal 13, the sustainable goal 13, is the climate action. And the reason I'm highlighting it here is because I want to show you that it does have a lot of trade-offs with other sustainable development goals, which include elimination of poverty, elimination of hunger, good health, and other goals. There are some synergies, but there are also some trade-offs. And I want to highlight specific solutions that maybe have trade-offs or synergies. So that's where I wanted to start from. So let's talk about the solutions. The book that really made me switch from thinking about problems to thinking about solution is called Project Drawdown. There's also a website. What this project was is about 60 scientists from a variety of fields got together for a couple of years and worked really hard to think about what specific actions can solve the climate problem and rank them by their impact on the CO2 reduction, and also work through what would it cost, what it's going to do to the jobs, is it really implementable, what kind of cultural problems are going to be faced if you're trying to implement this. So it's a really, really well thought through project because it was so interdisciplinary. You know, the scientists, the social scientists, the people from humanities, all were thinking about what are the actual solutions that might work. And those are ranked here on the slide. So the most powerful solution is something that we already see in California, onshore wind turbines. We need a lot more of those. And also utility scale solar photovoltaics. So it's not your residential rooftop solar, it's the big solar farms that can start producing electricity to phase out quickly fossil fuel energy generation. And these are the top because they can be implemented already today if we only had the infrastructure and the funding to put those together. We already have the technology, and that's why they have really big impact and ranked at the top. Less commonly known is that plant-rich diets is actually an incredibly effective solution. And this is because animal agriculture is producing a lot of methane. Methane is a very potent, 30 times more potent than the CO2 greenhouse gas. But in addition to that, it's also not staying in the atmosphere for as long as the CO2, which means if we can start reducing methane now, then in 10 to 12 years, we can actually reduce greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, which is what is driving global warming. So it's a very effective way to reduce our emissions right now. And then there are other, food waste, kind of for the same reason, is also ranked pretty high. And then you can see some other solutions that are very, very practical. And I put arrows next to them to indicate whether they have synergies or trade-offs with the goal of reducing global inequality. And so the green ones mean they're synergies. If we can help to provide clean cooking in the communities which are still relying on coal and firewood, it's also going to benefit the air quality and the health outcomes in those communities. So it has synergies. Silvopasture, so it's essentially you can allow cattle to graze in the forested areas that will also contribute to CO2 sequestration from the atmosphere, but also would allow to produce good outcomes for the population that is relying on this income. But there's some that you see are highlighted in red, which face trade-offs. In particular, I'll talk about reforestation and tree plantation and restoration of the forests. Those are frequently at odds with the goals of reducing global hunger and reducing global inequality, because obviously a big question is, whose land are you going to plant those trees on? And the cheapest land tends to be the land that's occupied by the poorest communities. And so if you're going by the most efficient solution, let me go buy the cheapest land there is and plant the trees on that, well, that's going to displace the most disadvantaged communities. And so that is at odds with the goal of reducing global inequality. So let me get a little bit into details about this. And I'm a macroeconomist. So there are macroeconomists and microeconomists. Microeconomists think about individual consumers, individual firms, and how the economic decisions are made. Macroeconomist, I'm also an international macroeconomist. So I think about the whole globe. I'm getting the bird's eye view. And so I'm showing you those global maps. So I want to talk a little bit more about solution of planting trees for carbon capture and preventing deforestation. And as I already mentioned, it may exacerbate inequality and hunger. So what this map is showing is the annual change in the forested area. And in green, it means there is an increase in forest coverage in those countries on average. And in red, it means there is a decrease. And so you can look at it and you can see, wow, Eastern Europe, Russia, India, and China are doing really well. They're planting trees. And then we have the, Oceania, some countries in Africa, and most of South America, with the exception of Chile, they're really cutting down the trees. And we probably all heard on the news about Amazon forest in Brazil, which is the most efficient carbon sequestration forest, is being cut quite a bit, okay? So, if you just look at that on the surface, you would say, well, we should really put pressure on Brazil to stop cutting Amazon, which is what a lot of discussion you see in the media is. As an economist, I say, hold on a second. Let's see what is creating this problem. And this is where this chart comes about. So what is really happening is China and India and Eastern Europe are importing a lot of their food from countries such as Brazil. As a result, Brazil needs to clear the arable land from the forest to grow this food to then export to countries like China and India. And so what this chart is showing is deforestation that is embedded in imported goods, right? So we're looking at the country, we say, if we look at how many trees had to be cut in order for you to import this amount of those goods, that is what's plotted on a horizontal axis. On a vertical axis, we see how much domestic forests are planted. So it's actually increase in the forest coverage in the home country. And so the countries that you see here at the top are the countries that were in green on the previous slide, and the countries at the bottom are the ones that were in red. And you see these are countries at the top are the countries that actually import a lot of deforestation. So when China is planting trees in their home country, they're also causing the trees to be cut in Brazil. So that it's a lot more complicated than just saying Brazil shouldn't cut their trees. Well, they are exporting food to China. And because the global economy, especially global food system, is so interconnected. That's why we need to account for those differences. So this is another way to look at that. If we look at the same map as before, but now I'm actually looking at how much deforestation is embedded in trade. Essentially, it's giving you the same the same story as I just told you. You see that Brazil, most of their deforestation is due to the exports. And it's the opposite for China and Russia and the US for that matter. So that's planting trees. So if you're thinking about where to plant trees, you also need to think about what kind of supply chain are you going to disrupt, because the trees are being cut not for fun. The trees are being cut to create space for generally agriculture, but sometimes other uses as well. Okay, another solution is plant-rich diets. That's something that I've been advocating for a really long time. I think there are many reasons to have a plant-forward, plant-only, or plant-rich diet. But greenhouse gas emissions are one of the reasons. The problem with the solution is, of course, that the food security is not at a high level everywhere, right? So it's very easy for us in California to say, well, you should just switch to the plant-based diet because you can go to the store. In fact, you can spend less money if you're eating plant-based than if you're eating a traditional diet. But that's not necessarily true in all countries in Africa, where animal food could be the only source of calories or the only source of high caloric foods available in order to prevent malnutrition and health outcomes. So we need to think about the distribution of food insecurity around the world. And so this map is giving you the distribution of share of the population that is experiencing food insecurity by country. And you can see that in a lot of countries, mostly in Africa, but also in the Middle East and some countries in South America and some countries in Asia, there is still a lot of population that is not getting sufficient calories per day. And so if we're going to say, well, let's just switch the world to plant-rich diets, it's one of the top solutions from the drop-down project. Well, we need to think about how we're going to solve the distribution of calories around the world to make sure people get access to what they need. And, one of the things that I think is true in the world, we are producing enough food globally. It's not a matter of not having enough calories produced, it's a matter of the distribution. We have a lot of food waste in developed economies, and we have a lot of food shortages in a lot of developing economies. So it's the distribution system, that's the infrastructure system that needs to be fixed to address the problem. We do not necessarily need to produce more. All right.
So Galina, we have a question back for solution number one real quick. Yeah. Someone asked why there wasn't any US data. I saw it on the map, but maybe not in your graph, right? Is the US in there?
I guess not. I did not create the data. So on the graph, I think we don't have necessarily this data from the actual forest area. And so we can calculate the import content of forest area for the US, but for the chart, you need to have both. And so I think that's why the US didn't make it into that scatter plot. And by the way, if you're interested in those issues or many other issues, this source ourworldindata.org is an amazing source of very brief articles and a lot of interactive charts. And that's where many of these charts came from. I highly recommend. Any other questions before I go to cooking? Okay. So clean cooking definitely has synergies. There were a few attempts to provide clean stoves to developing countries. There was a famous or infamous story of the World Bank supporting a project where the stoves were delivered to the villages in somewhere, I think in rural Asia, somewhere, maybe in subcontinent. And what they found out is that people did not use those stoves. Why didn't they use those stoves? Because those stoves didn't fit people's pots and pans. Because whoever was managing the project did not think about actually going to the ground and looking and talking to people about what is that they want. So if done correctly, clean cooking stoves can actually have a big impact because they would be replacing coal and wood burning stoves that are producing a lot of emissions and causing bad air and lung disease for children who grow up in those environments. So it definitely has synergies. The clean cooking could be different. It could be cleaner, right, with a propane tank. So infrastructure also needs to exist for this to be a possibility. And so what the map is showing here is that actually in the countries where it's most needed, there are challenges. So it's not enough to give people a stove. They also need to have access to the clean fuel, right? Either propane or, electricity. And I'll show you in a couple of slides that electricity is still an issue in a lot of countries around the world. And for a lot of Africa, we just don't have data. It tells you we need a lot more research on this. So solution 4 is electrification. So because we have technology to produce electricity cleanly, we need to electrify everything we can, everything that's currently using fossil fuels, like electric cars, right? And so once again, if you don't have access to electricity, or if your country does not produce enough electricity, that could be a challenge, especially in the transition. And so you can see some countries in Asia, but mostly in Africa, really do not have access to electricity. And that's where solution as distributed grid, with local small scale wind and solar could actually be part of the solution. So it's not going to be big numbers, but it can help in those remote villages and locations that do not currently have access to electricity, clean or not clean. And it's another of those solutions where developing countries can leapfrog the technology. So they currently have no electricity, but they would not go to the traditional power station, gas or coal power station electricity. They would go directly to distributed solar or something, or distributed wind, or maybe some other solutions. One thing I've learned for the solar, apparently for Africa especially, if there's land that is not arable, like a desert, you can install large, essentially like big, large dishes that would capture the sunlight and use that energy to heat up some kind of fluid that would then store energy in the form of heat, and then have a thermal power station that would produce electricity. And that technology exists, and it's incredibly efficient because it also gives you an ability to stretch out that solar energy through the storage solution to be accessible at night, for example, for lighting and cooking and things like that. So solutions exist, but who is going to pay for them, right? What is fair? And so I'm going to stop here to see if there are more questions about the solutions.
No questions at this point, Galina.
Okay, good. So, this question of fairness came to my mind when I read, about the, those cases where Amazon forest is being cut in Brazil illegally, right? And then international organizations are calling on Brazilian government to prevent this illegal Amazon cutting. And I was thinking, well, who benefits from, Amazon forest is the whole world. Why should Brazilian government bear the cost of enforcing the protection of Amazon forest? And also, nobody, as I said before, nobody's cutting the forest for fun. These are local communities that are very low income, and they're cutting forest mostly to grow some kind of cash crops. Okay. So here's how the international macroeconomist, thinks about that. First is the wrong way to look at it. I'll give you a straw man. Who emits the CO2, right? And if you look at the map, we have really good data. So here, the size of the square is proportional to the annual emissions of CO2. Data on other greenhouse gases are harder to get, but usually that's quite proportional because it's all proportional to the size of the economy. And you can see big China and smaller square India, and then they have US and EU 28 viewed as a country is pretty much similar in size to the US. And then you have South Africa, Brazil, and the rest of the countries are very small, right? So if you just look at that, you'll say, well, China should, stop emitting, right? They're emitting too much CO2, it's causing problems. But actually, if you look at the physics of the climate change, the rise in the temperature is proportional to the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's not proportional to the flow of how much we emit per year. It's proportional to the stock of how much there is. And the math behind it is really fascinating because it's not obvious that it would be such a linear relationship, but some things cancel out just exactly. In the physics, maybe somebody from physics department talks to you guys, maybe you can ask them to explain because I don't remember exactly to explain, but it's kind of a coincidence that increase in the temperature is linearly proportional to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So let's look at the concentration at the stock. So let's look at the cumulative emissions over last, so I think it says 1751, so 250 years, pretty much, pre-industrial time period. How much did those countries emit of the CO2 in order to get to the level of wealth that we are observing today, right? So you can think of emissions as kind of an input in production. And to get all the wealth that we have, you had to emit all these things in the past. And you see the distribution here is very different, right? The US and the EU developed countries are the biggest cumulative emitters. And yes, China is catching up very quickly, and so is Japan, but India is not nearly as big proportionally, right? So if you think about amount of wealth that was generated because we never paid for those emissions in the past, well, now it's time to pay for those emissions. The cost should be proportional to the cumulative emissions, not to the annual emission flow. And so then I can't even see Brazil here. Brazil here down in green. So then if you ask me who should be paying for protecting Amazon forest, I would say absolutely it's the US and the EU that need to put their money together through some international organization, provide, the NATO forces to protect Amazon forest, and provide some means of livelihood to people who will not be allowed to cut the forest, because they won't be able to grow this cash crops. So I think the solution is pretty, but it's a matter of how do you get to actually get people to agree to do this, right? But once you look at the cumulative emissions, what's fair becomes kind of an obvious question. And I don't know, I don't get to sit on those climate international negotiations. I wish I could be a bird on the branch there, but I wonder if people are talking like this or if people are talking about just emissions flow. So another thing, another right way to look at it is what is it in terms of per capita, right? If I say, okay, US and Europe need to be paying for those climate solutions, well, there are only so many people in the US and there are only so many people in other countries, in Europe, right? There are a lot more people in China. But if you divide cumulative carbon emissions by the number of populations today, what you're going to see is, well, Canada is the biggest emitter, and the US. So it is going to cost, Canada, US, Australia, and Russia, somehow UK, a lot of money per person in order to pay for this past emissions. But it also seems to be reasonable because we have built a lot, we're enjoying a very high standard of living thanks to those emissions that we didn't pay for in the past. So in a sense, it's the payback time. And, I think that's how one should think about that. Okay. Any questions before I go from who should to who is actually paying? I cannot hear you, Mike.
Sorry. We had a comment that your slide was dark and unreadable, but it looked good to me. So maybe Todd, you can text us offline.
I'm happy to make slides available. I sent them to Diana. They could be shared with anybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go to climate solution. And so who is paying right now, and are we spending enough? And so this is a chart that is this is a depressing chart of the day. It shows you how much money we need to be spending per year in order to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris goal, which, you know, some people say we can't, but if we, maybe we can. So it's basically showing that today we need to be spending over $3 trillion per year. And this amount should go up to $6 trillion by 2040. These are the latest numbers from IPCC, even though this chart is a little bit older. These are the numbers that are included in the last IPCC. How much are we spending now? We're spending about $600 billion, right? So 0.6 of $1 trillion, that's this blue area here. So we need, in less than 20 years, increase the per year spending by tenfold. How can we do that? That sounds like a lot of money. So what this thing on the right here shows, and I need to minimize the Zoom thing, is that a lot of money is currently coming, half the money is coming from the governments and, you know, international organizations. And some amount comes from corporations, some amount is coming from banks, and then some of it is coming from households, like me installing solar roof is contributing to climate solutions. The government pays a little bit for that, but not a lot. And then we see some nonprofits, so the funds that are contributing $5 billion, and there's also institutional investors that are contributing only $3 billion. And to me, this is a huge opportunity. So, because the total amount of assets under management globally in financial markets, depending on what you're including, is between 100 and $200 trillion. So essentially, let's just say low estimate, $100 trillion of assets under management globally. What we're asking is about 6% of that to be invested in climate solutions, which in fact could be profitable, right? So when you think about it that way, it doesn't sound so bad anymore. And so that, again, I'm thinking this is an opportunity, and I'm getting optimistic when I think that way. Well, so what, yeah.
We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Going back to the problem chart, is the data universally accepted or is it controversial? This question is from Eugene.
The data on
the problem charts that you showed, what the issues were. Yeah.
I don't know what problem chart. I didn't have problem chart. I only had solution
Okay.
chart.
Well, I guess I'd interpret that to just mean, you know, the data maybe about the per capita contribution versus the, you know, historical contribution. Is that data
this?
peer-reviewed and accepted?
So, yeah, so the data for CO2 cumulative emissions, it's pretty well accepted. There are a few sources here, and then Carbon Brief is another great source where you get kind of in an accessible format, a lot of scientific information, but it then all links to the peer-reviewed papers. So it all comes from reliable sources. And, you know, maybe in the numbers, there's probably some confidence interval around this because we did not really observe everything over, this is for last 150 years, but I'm pretty sure the ballpark is going to stay the same. And my conclusions are basically all just relying on a ballpark and not on specific numbers.
Okay, another question was Middle East countries that seem that, so the impression there are high per capita emissions there, and why don't we see those?
So these are not necessarily, let me see if it's in the flow. You do see some of them. So you see there's Iran here, Indonesia. Some of them are pretty small. I don't know in what color they're going to be. But in terms of cumulative emissions, they're not going to be very large. You have Russia. Russia is an oil country. That's probably why it's here. But another thing to keep in mind is that these are countries that are producing fossil fuels and then they're exporting them. So we are the ones who are actually burning them. And so it's the burning that creates emissions. The production, if you go to Persian Gulf, getting this oil out of the sea shelf is actually not a highly emitting process, right? They're just like those, like you've seen those in California, the pumps that are pumping oil. If you drive along, say, Highway 5, you probably see those. There's similar towers sitting in the Persian Gulf. So they're not necessarily highly emitting countries. But if you account for how they make their money because we are burning the fuel that they sell us, for sure. This is another layer of complexity that I don't want to get into, but it's an excellent question. Yeah.
Okay, we have some longer questions. I think we'll save those till later in the talk. So Linda and Isabella.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so that we were here. So I talked a bunch about the mitigation solutions. How do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? That's what, in the climate discussions is called as mitigation solution. We're trying to mitigate climate change. Another thing that we need to do is adapt to climate change. And, given that most people in the Zoom room are in the Bay Area or in Santa Cruz County, I don't need to tell people that climate change effects are already here. We had fire and we had flood all in the last 3 years. And that is for sure is going to be the worst, it has been the worst we've experienced, and it has a big component of climate change in it. And so we need to now spend the money on adaptation. And that can range from, building a seawall, restoring the West Cliff Drive, to nature-based solutions such as, restoring coastal marshes, or if you're in Florida, restoring coral reefs, mangrove forests. I work on a project where we show that in the areas in Florida that have mangrove forest coverage, the housing prices fell by a lot less following the hurricanes than in the areas that were more exposed because they didn't have mangrove forest coverage. So those nature-based adaptation solutions are great and getting pretty much no funding at the moment. But in general, from the $600 billion that I mentioned in the previous slide, most of it is going to mitigation because it's more exciting, it's absolutely needed, and it's kind of has global impacts sometimes in the future. But adaptation projects, they actually have local impacts today. So we need to spend a lot more money on those adaptation spending. And this is, the discussion about adaptation funding only started, I would say, 3 to 4 years ago, and only getting into mainstream this year. This year is the first year when I hear at the conferences on climate discussion around adaptation and not just around mitigation. That's because climate change effects are here. It's not sometime in the future. It's here and now. We got to do something about it. Protect nature, people, property. So how do we get the private sector to start investing? Because the governments on their own cannot increase the amount of spending on climate solutions by a factor of 10, right? There's just no money. So we get private investment. And so if you think about what a financial institution wants to do, financial institution wants to maximize returns conditional on minimizing the risks, right? So they want to have less risk, more return if possible. And investing in climate solution could be actually viewed as a hedge for climate risks, right? So if I'm investing in some, I don't know, fossil fuel companies or fossil fuel related companies, I'm exposed to transition risks such as potential of a carbon tax, for example, right? How can I protect myself from that risk? Well, I can also invest in alternative energy, in clean energy, solar, wind, and whatnot. That way, when carbon tax is imposed, or if carbon tax is imposed, I'm going to have losses on my fossil fuel portfolio, but I'm going to have extra gains on my alternative fuel portfolio. And generally, financial institutions like these things. They like to hedge against risks, and climate risks are important to hedge. There are also physical climate risks. So you might have some money in the properties that are exposed to fire or flood. Then investing in adaptation solution will provide a hedge for those physical risks. So when we understand this, why don't we see more money flowing into climate solutions, right? And so I think it's something that probably needs to be discussed more. I think there is a small component there of climate risks are not properly priced in the markets. I'm trying to write a paper that would summarize what we know about how much climate risks are priced in the financial markets. It turns out a lot harder than I thought. So I don't have an answer yet. But I think it's going to be a smaller portion. I think the bigger problem is that it's actually hard for financial institutions to invest in climate solutions because of the kind of, I would just say, weird investment profile of those projects, right? So if you think about, if you're investing in some new product, I don't know, a fancy running watch, right? You're going to estimate your demand, you're going to estimate your capital expenses, and so you're going to spend some money today, and then for a certain number of years until competitors get to you, you're going to make good profits, right? So that's kind of a standard investment project. Now with climate solutions, it's a little bit easier with adaptation because yes, you invest today and you get benefits in the next few years. With climate mitigation solutions is very hard because you spend money today, but the benefits occur to the whole world over the next 50 years. You can't exactly pocket that. But even for the adaptation solution, that's the second bullet point, the payoffs are not easily financialized. What it means is the following. When I produce the watch and I sell it, I get the money. I get to put them in the bank. When I invest in a seawall, say, I spend money today, what do I get from it? I get reduced future expenses from potential damages, right? That is very hard. It's uncertain. It's not actual cash, unless I can somehow save on my insurance premium or something like that. We're working on that. But it's not very easy. I cannot go to the bank and say, give me a loan, I'm going to invest in the seawall, and then in the future, I'm not going to end up spending as much money cleaning up after the flood, right? And so bank is not going to, how am I going to return the loan? So it's not very easy. Frequently, the payoffs from climate solutions are distributed across stakeholders. It's kind of obvious for mitigation solution because the whole world benefits. But even for adaptation solution, there are a lot of benefits. There's benefits from actual avoided property losses, right? There are also benefits from avoiding hardship to certain parts of population. There are all benefits to nature, to public infrastructure, to public access to the beach. How do you put, dollar values on all of this? And how do you get everybody to pitch in? And that's where we get a little bit of a free rider problem. Everybody is expecting somebody else to solve the problem for them. And then, of course, there are a lot of risks, like with any investment, but here especially, how do you verify that it's an actual climate solution? How do you measure the impact? The costs are usually pretty clear. It's going to cost me so much to, implement something. But how do you measure the benefits? It's very complicated. And sometimes, given all these attributes, maybe I can still find some impact investor who is going to give me, I don't know, $2 million, right? But sometimes the scale of these projects is so large that it's just very difficult to fund. It's very difficult to fund somebody who is going to give me $100 million to fund a project because it's so risky. Nobody wants to put all the eggs in one very large project. So what can we do? Well, we need to do a lot of thinking. So a few things that I think might be helpful. We now have a lot of financial innovation. It could be put to good use. There are some examples of structured finance where a nonprofit like the Nature Conservancy and the government and the private financial sector and some US government that provides some kind of underwriting for some risks all get together to create a financial instrument that then can fund something that is, protecting the world, reducing the climate change impacts. For the scale, we have fintech with a lot of ways to tokenize the expenses. It's the, big fancy word. And so maybe there is a way I can somehow crowdfund my climate solutions that, solve some of the problems. And maybe we can have some other financial innovation. So I think we have a lot of resources here in the Bay Area, in fact, to start tackling some of these issues. And some of them are already being tackled. I'll give you two examples. Frontierclimate.org is the organization that is basically pre-selling carbon offsets for the future. So an airline that has made a net zero commitment will need to buy some carbon offsets in order to get to the net zero because they're not going to stop flying and we don't have electric planes yet. And they know how much they're going to need to buy. And so what they can do is essentially commit to buying those credits for next 20 years from that organization. And that money, that commitment can then be invested into building a carbon sequestration factory, right? And so that's how we actually get the people who need to, for some reason, put money into the climate solutions with the projects that need the funding. We get them connected, and that's one example. Another example, one of our Santa Cruz friends and his friend, they have a startup called Climatize, and they just got today the FINRA license or whatever it is, so they can now operate. What they want to do is essentially get your spare change to invest in mostly mitigation projects. So you would have an app on your phone and all your spare change is going to go into your investment account that then is going to get put together and put into the installing solar roofs, installing other clean energy things. So check it out. It's on climatize.org, I think. I might be wrong, but it's Climatize anyway. And so this is a way to tokenize investment in climate solutions. And you can get returns on your investment, but you don't care too much because just spare change. Anyway, another thing we're thinking is that, there could be solutions that are actually profitable. And so there has to be a way to sort the projects into those that are profitable and therefore can be funded by traditional or impact investment and don't actually need NGO or government help. And those projects should be funded, somehow packaged and sold to private investors. There could be other projects that maybe have somewhat lower return on investment that financial markets would want, or maybe too much risk. And then we can get government insurance or government and nonprofit grants to boost the return on investment for those projects. And then we can get private investment attracted. And then there's also projects that are absolutely needed, but maybe they don't have good financial profile. So those will be funded by the government. But if we can sort the projects in these buckets, we can protect the government funds from being spent on the projects that are actually profitable and should be financed by private sector investment, and save the money to fund the projects that need to be implemented but are not directly financially attractive.
So Galina, we have one comment from Daniel. Maybe it's sort of an analogy to some of these financial instruments are like insurance, right? He said we pay for something we hope we never need, and is that a way for the for corporations or emitters to look at it?
Absolutely, and so we are actually talking about that. Thank you for the prompt. So that's one of the ways to financialize future avoided costs, right? So if I can work together with the insurance company and show, it's mostly true for the adaptation projects, right? If I can show that spending money today on some adaptation project is going to reduce my risks going forward, that insurance company might be willing to extend a larger insurance for me or cut down the insurance premium and give me a paper to that extent. And that's the paper I can take to the bank, right? I can say, okay, I'm going to save the money on my insurance premiums big enough, maybe I can get also some money from the government that, maybe that adaptation project also protects some public infrastructure. So I think it's complicated enough, and there are enough different economic agents that benefit from those solutions that we need not a dialogue, we need a conference of all stakeholders involved in order to get this done. And it's happening slowly, and it needs to be more mainstream, and it needs to be now. And so I'm actually very happy to see a lot of this happening at UC Santa Cruz. So, for this climate solution marketplace, I just applied for a grant. Let's see if Office of the President decides to give it to me, then we can start solving some of these problems with the actual projects on the ground. Any other comments I should address right now? I'm about to wrap up.
I think we're good right now. Getting some questions coming in, and I'll ask people to, this is a good time to start typing your questions and taking a look at the Q&A box. You can upvote questions that you think are interesting, and we'll ask them sooner.
All right, excellent. So just the takeaways, I showed a lot of charts and I said a lot of words, but I want you to be more optimistic about climate change because the solutions are available. We have innovation happening, but we already have solutions today, and we're just going to get better solutions going forward. Some solutions involve trade-offs, so we should be very careful when we think about implementing different solutions. We really need to think about the impact on inequality and social justice and just all these unintended consequences that frequently are overlooked when things are happening quickly. Some solutions have synergies, so those probably need to be funded first because they benefit in more than one way. Then I talked about the fairness, that it's cumulative, not current emissions. That should be the basis of how we cost share globally the payment for the climate solutions. And we absolutely need a lot more research to analyze all this, and we need a lot more money to fund the climate solutions. And I don't think we can get to the investment we need at the time frame we have without involving private sector. So I'm one of the organizers of this Catalyzing Private Financial Markets for Climate Solution conference that we're organizing together with Santa Clara University. I'm a co-director of the Center for Analytical Finance here at UC Santa Cruz. And we got some money from the new Santa Cruz Center for Climate Resiliency for this conference. And we have amazing keynote speakers. And I'm just reviewing the submissions for that workshop. So we'll see if we're going to make it a small brainstorm workshop or if we're actually going to broadcast it on YouTube. I'm going to keep you guys posted on that. And I was told I should pitch for the money. So I will. So Center for Analytical Finance is the research center at the economics department, or more generally in the social sciences division at UC Santa Cruz. And we have two work programs. One is FinTech and one is financing climate change solutions. And we have funding for FinTech, but we could use more funding for climate change solution projects. So if you want to donate, there is a link here on the slides, but you also just choose Center for Analytical Finance as your designation on online giving page. And I'm going to stop here.
Marvelous, thank you. Many important points. Linda wants to point, though, at electrification and electric cars that require currently lithium batteries.
Yeah.
Which are also a mining issue in many countries who happen to have this lithium. It's also costly to process and takes several years to be ready for use.
That's true.
It's a trade-off, I guess.
Yeah, that's a trade-off. I mean, the only thing I can say, the technology is relatively new. And you know, if you think about the photovoltaics, for example, they used to be expensive. In the beginning, they were made of some materials. Again, I'm not a specialist on this, but like I absorb some things. So they were made of the materials that were also very costly and not necessarily that great. But nowadays, the photovoltaics are much better, much more efficient. So I think the technology will catch up. You know, even the batteries today are so much better than they were 10 years ago, which is why we can have electric vehicles. But another issue with electric vehicles, you know, you have to know how your electricity is produced, right? So if you live in the US and you live like in the southeast, that's where most of the coal plants still are, coal power plants still are. And so if your energy is mostly produced with coal, you absolutely do not want to drive an electric vehicle. You're much better off with internal combustion. It's less polluting, right? All the EV is doing is shifting pollution from the city to where the power plant is. If you live in California, however, we have a lot of renewables, we have a lot of natural gas, and EV engines are much more efficient. So you definitely produce less emissions by driving an electric vehicle here than a internal combustion one.
Oh, so we have a question from Isabella. How do shifting values such as global consumerism and extractivism fit in with these economic solutions? If we need to conduct research and collaborate with local communities to ensure these economic solutions, such as transitioning to clean cooking in rural communities, are effectively implemented, what does this look like? So this is a question about, you know, convincing the population to adopt these solutions.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. So we need, and that's one of the trends that I see that's pretty new, is community engagement is part of every discussion, right? In fact, in this grant I just applied, the community engagement was one of the parts I had to respond to. Sorry, I'm sorry. My mom is convalescing in my house, and
it's fine. We don't
actually. Everything is okay. So sorry, just got a little distracted for a moment. Yeah, so community engagement is pretty much a requirement in order for these grants to be distributed. So to receive a grant, right? So in my proposal, I had to say, well, who am I going to talk to make sure it's the solution that people actually want? As this World Bank example shows, like if you don't engage with communities, you're going to end up wasting a lot of money.
So Todd raises the question of the relationship between defense expenditure and projected climate change. I know that there was discussion from the Department of, I'm going to build on Todd's point, that a significant amount of conflict was expected to be generated as the climate worsened. How do you allocate resources between defense and projected climate change is in question.
is not an easy question. So I think defense expenses are mostly government expenses, right? And so I don't think governments have enough money, even without those extra defense expenses, to solve the climate problem on their own, which is why we need private financial markets. But it's absolutely true. So climate change is not just, a weather problem, right? It's a major social problem. And, if you read about the scenarios of substantial global warming, you see projections of mass migration and, mass shift in the resource availability in the world, and that is likely to lead to conflicts. I'm not a sociologist, but there were a number of studies that are showing it pretty clearly. So I think it's a big problem, which is why we need to invest a lot in mitigation right away, as we're investing in adaptation, to avoid those, giant problems that, are going to produce all kinds of social fallout. Yeah.
A question from Isabella. I guess we were talking about how to incentivize consumers, but how do you propose we convince governments to invest in climate solutions, that especially ones that are financially unattractive, those high risk?
Yeah. So the governments are made of people, and in majority of the world, those are elected democratically. And so it's, the voters do have a say. So you can call your representative. It's amazing how effective that is. You can actually just dial your representative's office and, leave a message. And your message could be, we need to invest more in climate change. And you can vote for candidates. You can support candidates that are taking the problem seriously. And, people get the government they deserve. Somebody smart said that, right? So it's, government's not something abstract over there that needs to be convinced. It's the people we elected. So in the US, I think voting is the first big step. I'm pretty sure this audience, everybody votes, but you can also be an active voter and talk to your congresspeople. You can create a PAC, you can create a political action committee for climate, and you can start raising money for the candidates that are taking climate change seriously. And, if you raise, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000, you actually get to sit in a room with them and talk to them for an hour. So it's quite powerful. The oil industry has big political action committees, the climate doesn't. So that's something that could be done, given that, the structure of campaign finance in the US. That's one way to do it.
So this segues into Deborah's question, actually. She wants to know 3 things that the average person can do. I think we've got one big one. We have a couple more things that you would suggest for the average person.
Oh, so you want me to suggest more things?
Yes.
Well, so if you can, next time you're upgrading your appliances, make sure they're clean, electric. If you can, invest in rooftop solar, because we can't wait for the government to do things for us. Ride your e-bike or your EV and eat plant-based, and call your Congress people is a big one. And I think also just talk to everybody you can. I think in the US, we're still kind of in this world where the climate change issue is somehow a partisan issue. So if you have climate deniers in your friends and family world, talk to them in the way that wouldn't make them feel defensive. Talk to them about, hey, remember the flood or remember the fire. These are going to happen more frequently. So I think not being, we live in California where, most people are kind of not climate deniers, but I think don't be shy about, people pushing back, just find a way to talk to people in the way that doesn't put them on the defensive.
So Mike, I apologize. I'm going to push in for one more question from my side. And this also is from Kenneth about insurance companies. Now he asks, I want to build on this, but he's asking about whether they're financing green projects. This comes off a conversation I had yesterday with a property owner up in the foothills of California. And he is actually no longer able to find fire insurance, forest fire insurance in his area. He doesn't even live in a forest. So he's in the center of a small city up there, but they will not sell him insurance. It seems to me that the insurance companies are pretty exposed here, and that if they had some kind of a cooperative effort, they might be able to bring together organizational infrastructure to solve this. Enough said. Are they doing something? Can they do something?
Great question.
Yes. So I also live in the area where I can't get insurance for my house at all because I'm in a fire zone and flood zone from the flash flood. I live actually in Marin in the canyon.
Ouch.
So we're with a California insurance. But so theoretically, I think yes, right? So insurance companies could get together and invest in some fire protection projects to reduce the risk of wildfires in the area where they want to have business. But frequently, if the area is small enough, it's just cheaper for them to get out. And that's what they do, right? So they stop covering certain areas. And at a recent conference, I actually talked to some insurance industry professionals about that. And they said, so we can't expect insurance companies to do things on their own, right? So, but they said, look, if you can show me a credible model that with a certain project, there's going to be risk reduction, then I can, write a letter of commitment that I will come back to that area and provide insurance, which is going to then reduce the costs of ownership, property ownership for people who live there or work there, have businesses there. And so the insurance company can provide some kind of, underwriting for me to then go to a financial institution or go to the government and say, look, I'm going to invest in this adaptation project and it's going to produce some savings for me. It's going to produce some savings for California Department of Insurance because the state of California is now on the hook for a lot of those insurance policies that meant to be temporary, but ended up being quite permanent. So there is funding. So California Department of Insurance is big on the adaptation discussion because for them, it is really money on the table. And so they're willing to talk and do whatever they can to help, but they don't have a ton of money to fund the solutions. So it needs to be collaborative.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to follow up on the last question about or your advice to contact our government representatives, and I'm wondering, what should we be asking them to prioritize, because there's so many different things we could be working on, right? Like what is within our local government control, what's in the federal government control? Should we be looking at cap and trade? Should we be advocating for what, right? Among all these options.
Yes. So when it comes to climate, my answer is always all of the above. But I think there is a value of focusing on certain things. So I think, you can ask a local government. So you have to know you have to talk to people about the things that are in their jurisdiction, right? So if you talk to your local government, you talk about adaptation projects. They're not going to implement cap and trade in just the city of Santa Cruz, right? That's not going to happen. But they can, help guarantee or fund or, fast track the permits for some kind of adaptation projects, right? If you talk to your, US Congress representatives, talk to them about carbon tax, talk to them about, quantity limits on how much emissions could be, some form of cap and trade or like emission trading system like we actually have, I just learned that Europe has implemented emission trading system mostly for CO2. In the US, we actually have emission trading system. Does not include CO2. It includes this other pollutants. It was implemented way before to clean the air quality in the cities. So it includes like particular pollution and other things. And we have a trading system for this. So extend that emission trading system to include greenhouse gases and, stop subsidizing fossil fuel, stop subsidizing animal agriculture, start subsidizing alternatives, start subsidizing, we already have some subsidies. I just did my taxes. I got to write off my solar roof, part of it. More of that so people have incentives. And you can talk about local incentives as well. I know in Santa Cruz, I guess you get some incentive for electric bicycle or something like that. Here in Marin County, where I live, we get local subsidies for like weatherproofing the windows or something like that. So.
Okay, thanks.
This segues into another David's question. Why has, and he's making a statement here, I think, with a question, why has the European cap and trade and the US equivalent not provided a successful financial solution to incentivize RE investment? How can it be adjusted?
I would say, so in the US, we don't actually have any efficient cap and trade, and we don't have very good enforcement for carbon credits, right? So there is a lot of, let me just say, ineffectual carbon credits are issued to activities that are not actually reducing CO2 equivalent emissions. So we do not have good carbon pricing. We do not have a good verification. We have no way of, proving. So suppose I have a business and I engage in some activity that is reducing my emissions. It's very costly for me to get it certified so I can actually issue carbon credits. And then in the carbon credit market, I'm competing with those, ineffectual solutions, which makes those carbon credits too cheap. And so I don't want to invest in climate solutions because I cannot get a private return to that. So we need some kind of audit. So there is another thing that is happening, is a little unfortunate. So the Securities and Exchange Commission had a proposal issued about a year ago for comments on the climate-related risk disclosure. And there was some glitch in the system, so they had to reopen for comments, so they weren't able to get it through before the new Congress took place in January. So now it's kind of indefinitely, in the comment thing, is not clear when it's going to go through, but that proposal was suggesting that all publicly traded companies actually report their emissions. So you as an investor would be able to say, oh, I don't want to invest in this company. I want to invest in the other company. This company has too much climate risk. And that would incentivize the companies to either hedge those risks or reduce those risks. But right now it's still at the proposal stage, unfortunately.
Okay, I have a quick comment from Kenneth, just addressing Deborah, top 3 things each of us can do. So Kenneth's list is 1, electrify your car and home. That includes heat pumps for your house. 2, plant-based diet, and 3, rooftop solar. So see if you agree with that. It's the top 10.
100% agree. I have rooftop solar, I have heat pump, and I'm vegan.
Yep, thank you, Kenneth. Yeah, considering those 2. Question from Cindy. I often wonder about unintended future consequences with certain proximate solutions, such as moving from gas to electric cars, with respect to other environmental impacts that electric cars might have. Do you have thoughts on de-risking future consequences, things like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of technologies, we shouldn't think about them as final technologies. It's true that we had internal combustion cars for over 100 years, which is kind of really odd for one technology to persist for so long. But, if you think about like self-driving cars, they're driving all around San Francisco, those Waymo things. And, I think EVs is just a transition thing. I think we're not going to have personal cars pretty soon in the future. And they're going to be, you call the driverless Uber to get anywhere you want or something like that. It's much more efficient than individual. So I think, a lot of things will need to change to get to the kind of circular economy, sustainable way of living. We can't change everything at once. So I would say, better whatever we can do now that's better than what we did yesterday is already good. And yes, it's not perfect, but it doesn't mean we should do what we did yesterday, which is even worse. So that's kind of my attitude to that.
So we have a clarification request. What is G insurance? What is green investment? What do you mean by that? Those were used, two terms used in your slides.
Of what insurance? Sorry, I didn't.
G insurance.
Really?
Is that a term?
I don't think so. Oh, government insurance. Sorry.
Government insurance. Okay.
Big G for government. Yes, government insurance. Green investment is basically impact investment when investor is willing to take a smaller return relative to the market, as long as they're ensured that they're investing in something that is either, could be passive green investing, which means you're excluding investment into fossil fuel related industries or any other greenhouse gas emitting industries, or it could be active green investment where you invest in climate solutions, such as, renewable energy and things like that.
And government insurance, is the government kind of backstopping private insurance? Is that?
Yeah, so not necessarily private insurance. So the government has a lot, or governments generally have a lot of different programs. US government, for example, has a program that if you're investing in some foreign country's project or something like that, or business, they can actually provide insurance for political risk that you might be facing. So suppose you're investing in some project in Brazil, and there is a risk that some government takes over in Brazil and then they just expropriate all the foreign investors. That would be a political risk that the US government has an organization that would backstop that.
I think this is going to have to be the last question, and I'm going to take one that kind of summarizes your bottom line. This is from Felipe. Do you think we'll be able to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming? Are you that optimistic?
Well, it depends by when. So I'm an economist, so I don't make forecasts. But here's what I want to say about this. I learned something recently that even though there is this linear relationship between CO2 emission concentration and the warming, there's quite a big confidence interval on how much warming we get for a given concentration of greenhouse gases. And so in order to stay below 1.5, we need a lot of action to reduce the concentration of CO2 or not increase the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But we also need luck because it's, the physics are quite complicated and nonlinear and whatnot. And so, it could be for the same concentration, we get 2 degrees or we can get 6 degrees. And so we're just hoping we get 2 degrees, but we also need to act to make sure we're moving that interval from 2 to 6 to like 1 to 4 or something like that. So I think we can. I wouldn't put a probability on that. But we need to do a lot today in order to get there.
Wonderful. A lot to think about today, Galina. Thank you very much. And I'd like you all to join me in giving applause to Professor Galina Hale.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your research with us this evening. Now, again, if you want to support this fine work of our professor, we encourage you to make a gift. Galina, I don't know if you could repeat again the organization that it was for, and you do find the link down in the chat box. The organization again was?
It's the Santa Cruz Center for Analytical Finance.
Santa Cruz Center for Analytical Finance. Thank you. So our thanks also to the staff of the Alumni Relations and University Events offices who organized this webinar. Again, a fine group. Thank you, Shana, Diana, Paulina, and sorry, Kristen. Also, April's a co-organizer of the series. And I'm forgetting somebody here, Mike.
Well, let's thank the audience for the amazing questions. I wish we could get to all of them. We still have a bunch of great questions in the Q&A box, but we're running short on time. So thanks everyone for being so engaged and joining us tonight.
Yes. And come back next time. So our next Slugs and Steins will be Monday evening, May 8th. And it's going to be on how the recently initiated James Webb Space Telescope is resetting astronomy. So this telescope is astonishingly complex, yet it has exceeded what was hopeful it would accomplish. We'll be led through a story about the GWST, its development, the challenges it overcame, its stunning accomplishments by none other than our Garth Illingworth, one of the key early leaders for what was to become the GWST. His engagement started before Santa Cruz while he was deputy director of the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore. It continued after he joined UCSC and the Lick Observatory in 1988, and he remained engaged through the telescope's launch in 2021, making him the last original architect to remain involved. The recipient of numerous awards, Garth has spent over 2 decades exploring with the Hubble telescope for the earliest galaxies in the billion years of the universe, and he continues that work with the GWST. So join us. Meanwhile, take note, the Alumni Weekend is coming in just a few days. In fact, this weekend. This year we'll be celebrating and honoring our Golden Slug alumni, graduates celebrating their 50+ reunion milestone. You can find out more at alumniweekend.ucsc.edu. Now, as part of this, or at least at the same time as the Climate Change Conference will be happening on April 13th at 6 p.m. Presenters will discuss the social and economic transformations that will be required in order to address the health impacts of climate change. On another note, in London, also in April 27th at the Tate Modern, Isaac Julian, the Santa Cruz professor, will lead Slugs through his exhibition, What Freedom Is to Me, which includes film, dance, photography, music, theater, painting, and sculpture. So on behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, thank you all very much for joining us. And please come back on May 8th, 6:30 p.m. for our next virtual event. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.